Good evening and welcome to the Leadership Institute's live lecture. I'm your host, Patricia Simpson, Director of Political and Online Training here at the Leadership Institute. We're broadcasting live, so please ask questions during the presentation by typing into the Facebook tab below your screen or by emailing me live at leadershipinstitute.org. On tonight's webinar, our guest is Ryan Adams, Grassroots Coordinator here at LI, who will discuss voter registration. Ryan, thank you for joining us this evening.
Absolutely, Patty. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Now, I know that voter registration is obviously very important during an election year, but what about off years when there isn't a major election going on? Is it still important, and how do you make sure that it's a success?
Absolutely, Patty. Absolutely, Patty. Voter registration definitely we're sitting here right now just a few months out from a paramount election in 2012. And it's very important that we get out there and we're actually finding registered voters, and we're working very hard to find them, and we're getting them out there, registering them to vote. Voter registration is something that we can be doing all the time. Conservatives, we tend to forget about this until it's too late. We tend to completely forget that voter registration is definitely something that we can be doing, that we can actually be working on. So let's just dive right on in. The U.S. Census reported that in 2008 campaign cycle resulted in roughly 146 million new registered voters, or registered voters that are out there. That's a gigantic number of registered voters. The 28 states that allow registration with a party, whether you walk in and you vote Republican, Democrat, decline to state, whatever you register when you actually register to vote, between 2006 and 2008, Democratic totals for voter registration increased 12.2%, a massive, massive, massive increase in voter registration. Meanwhile, the Republican registration effort only grew 1.7%. A vast, vast, vast chasm there between the two efforts. Kind of shocking when you think about it. And there are a lot of reasons that go into this. The excitement leading up to the 2008 campaign was capitalized on by the liberals, by the other side, making sure that they were finding as many new voters as possible, working very hard to find the new voters, and really getting out there and actually working about them. So you really look at this and you think about conservatives. We're outnumbered. We're outnumbered in the voter registration fight. We're out there. People are always constantly working for it, but we're kind of outnumbered. And it's kind of a shocking thing to happen. Conservatives are vastly outmanned in voter registration efforts. The grocery store that I walk by on a regular basis, their people are out there. They're constantly registering new voters. Now, they're out there every day between about 6:30 and 7:30 when I walk home. People are starting to leave to go home from work, and they're registering a new voter. Now, they're not going to hit a lot of new people. They might hit 2 or 3 people here, a person there, but they're going to find these new voters. And that's a whole nother person. You do that over the course of a week, that number starts to grow exponentially. So they're working it. The left is out there working. We're not. Conservatives, they're not really out there. 9 times out of 10 when I walk by someone holding a voter registration drive on the street, they're not with an organization, they're not with a candidate that I, as a conservative, would side with. I can probably count on one hand how many times I've actually walked by and it was someone that I would actually side with, that if I wasn't already a registered voter, that I would actually side with. It's out there. We're outmanned. The other thing we have to look at is conservatives are drastically outspent in their voter registration efforts. If you look at the 2008 cycle, leading up to the 2006 cycle, the Democratic National Party spent almost 10 times what the Republican Party spent on voter registration. They knew they were out there. They had to continue to grow the base, find the new voters, making sure that people were actually getting out there and working it to find the new voters. They capitalized 100% on the excitement of the election leading up to it, and they were able to find those big numbers by having the resources on the ground to hold really good voter registration drives. They registered a record number of new people, a massive, massive, massive number of new people. So why? Why is voter registration so key? Why is it out there? Well, the thing is that voter registration is the single most effective project that a conservative activist, a conservative organization can undertake year-round to elect more conservatives. We have to constantly be out there. It can't be an afterthought. Voter registration, your voter registration cycle, your voter registration techniques cannot be an afterthought. You've got to be constantly building up to it, finding those new voters, working it. Of course, there's a cutoff. Of course, after this date, you can't vote in this election. That timeline is out there. However, statistics do show us that on average, new registered voters are 60% more likely to turn up to vote on election day. 60%, a massive number. If we could say that we could go out and register these people and 60% of them are going to be more likely to go out and actually vote, that's a gigantic leap that we've already taken. And that was simply by going out, working it, finding the new voters, and getting out there and getting these people out there, registering them to vote. It's very key. It's one of the most important things we can be doing out there, finding these finding these new people, unregistered people, and actually going out and registering them to vote.
Now, this is a question from one of our viewers at home. And they ask, how is it that conservative candidates can win if they're outnumbered in voter registration by liberals? How is it possible?
Absolutely. You know, that goes into another lecture for another time. But I think one of the main things you have to think about there, even if we are outnumbered in the voter registration numbers, we see the conservative candidates are out there winning. And when that happens, it's a beautiful thing when it happens. That goes into so many other things. That goes into the fact that not only did we find out what we had, we used what we had to work with, we were able to actually turn those voters out in massive numbers better than the other side. It doesn't just necessarily, you can't always just look at your voter registration totals and assume that that's how the election's going to go. It still goes down very importantly. There are a lot of other mechanics that go into this, so it would be a discussion for another day, but there are a lot of other mechanics that go into making sure that those voters actually go out. That doesn't mean that you ever stop going out to recruit numbers. Just because it appears on paper that we're outnumbered and there's no chance we could win, that doesn't mean that you don't stop going out and continue doing other campaign activities that are also very important to your get out the vote effort. Very massively important.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about why voter registration is so important to the conservative cause?
Absolutely. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, voter registration is so important to the conservative cause because without finding those new voters, without actually getting out there, working the groundwork, getting the groundwork laid, it gets where it's kind of stale. I mean, and let's kind of look at sort of the kind of interesting thing that goes on out there right now with the voting demographics. One of the interesting thing out there right now is that the conservative base, we're often viewed as an older party or as an older movement. You know, our people aren't there. Voter registration is sometimes the first step someone will take in the political process, is just getting registered to vote. Maybe not even voting itself, but actually getting registered to vote. That's the first step. That's the first time you actually get to say, I matter. My beliefs matter. And it's important that I have that opportunity, that I have that chance to actually get out there and vote. That's the reason the voter registration is so important to the conservative process. 100% it's out there. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of continue on here. But as I said, I want to reiterate again, this is something you can be doing all day, anytime. You're not always going to be at a campaign office doing voter ID calls or working on get out the vote calls. However, voter registration is something you can do year-round, anytime. So what are you going to need? You know, we're actually going to go out and actually put on a voter registration drive. You know, what are some items we're going to possibly need for this? Well, you know, pens and clipboards. Pens and clipboards. Seems like whatever you do in campaign life, you need a pen and a clipboard. For a successful voter registration drive, I'd recommend a folding table as well. Name badges, frequently asked questions for your volunteers that might be doing this. Obviously, you got to have voter registration forms. You have to have them. Absentee ballots. You know, it's always something good to also have, or absentee ballot request forms. Always something very important. And organizational material. Who are you? What are you out here for? Making sure that people know exactly what they're getting when they come up to you to go. Some things you'll need to know. You'll need to know the election timeline. When is the voter registration cutoff in this state? When are we allowed to vote? When are we allowed to continue registering voters? What's the last day that I have to be registered in order to vote in the upcoming election? Something that you'll notice that I didn't say you kind of needed to have for your voter registration drive. And this is something that I'm going to say it, and a lot of you out there in TV land are going to wonder what am I talking about. I detest when I see at an event, I see a sign that says register to vote here. I really, really, really do not like seeing the sign register to vote here. The reason being, if you put the register to vote sign up, you have to register anyone that comes up to request a ballot from you. You cannot deny giving someone a ballot for whatever reason. You can't do it. If they come and request a form, you have to give it to them. There's no screening process. There's no way of knowing how this person is going to vote. No screening process whatsoever. You could register someone who is a dyed-in-the-wool liberal that has absolutely no intention of voting for your candidate, and you've just done them a favor. You've just put an extra vote in the other guy's hand. Remember, that person is 60% more likely to actually go out and vote. So a voter registration drive sign, register to vote here, just something that I recommend not having. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can do this, the screening process. I usually do something like sign this petition. And the petition will be a petition for something that's, you know, one of the conservative stalwart movements. Right now, it seems to be the conservative movement right now. Sign this if you want to repeal Obamacare. or something to that effect. If someone wants to sign that petition for you, the next question, are you registered to vote? However, if they don't want to sign the petition, it's, well, all right, thank you, have a nice day. You didn't give the other guy the vote. That person now still, as far as we know, is an unregistered voter, and as far as we know, we don't have to worry about giving that vote to the other side. So it's very important that you think strategically about this. Think very strategically about this when you're doing these. Set up your voter registration booth in a targeted area, somewhere that has a lot of foot traffic, somewhere where people are going to be. You can't get known in private. That's one of my favorite quotes from Primary Colors. John Travolta says this in Primary Colors. You can't get known in private. You can't register new voters in private. I was working a voter registration drive once where there was this large music festival, 10,000 people were going to descend on Huntsville, Alabama. They were going to descend in Huntsville, Alabama, and this large music fest. We initially had gotten space for the organization I was working with. We had gotten space right at the entranceway. Great place. People were going to have to walk right by us to get to and from the events and the festivities. Well, one of the really nice people thought they were doing a good job, decided they didn't want to be sitting there. They didn't want to be there. They thought that we would be, overwhelmed. It's kind of what you want to have happen at a voter registration drive. Decided they wanted to move us. So obviously we got moved to probably the worst location for what we were doing that evening. We got moved to the very back, just past the porta potties. I mean, people didn't even have to walk by us to get to the facilities. So it's very important. You have to set these things up in a very strategic location. By having this in a strategic location, you're going to be able to pick up new voters. You're going to be able to find these people. And of course, this person's rationale was, well, you don't know what kind of shenanigans or people are going to get up to right at the entranceway. People are going to be coming and going. There could be all sorts of, kind of hoopla and shenanigans going on. So it's really important that we realize that your location is key. Target-rich environment. That's one of the main things in a voter registration drive. Something else you can do, even in these economic times, you need to be out there walking in the newly constructed neighborhoods. I mean, are people still building houses out there? But get out there. Find those people that are actually moving into newly constructed neighborhoods, people that are out there working. If you see a moving truck in your neighborhood, walk up to the door immediately. When you're moving, I moved recently myself. When you move, you luggage and clothes and packing and just the craziness that goes with moving. The last thing you're going to think about is voter registration. But it gives you a chance to get out there and meet your new neighbor, and then you have a chance to register your new voter in the neighborhood. So look for signs, look for things like this. Here's one that's out there that I think is one of the more creative ways, and one of the, as conservatives, we just completely forget about this. New citizen naturalization ceremonies. Huge, huge. The people that are coming in that are becoming naturalized citizens of the United States, they have worked for this. This is not something you walk in, you take a quick little punch hole test and you walk back out. These are people that have worked for the American way. They want to be an American citizen. And there's nothing more American than taking part in an election. So it's important that we get out there, we find them, go to those naturalization ceremonies. They occur everywhere. Go out there and find them, find these people, get in touch with them. Remember, they've just become citizens, so they're definitely not registered to vote. They fought for this. They've worked for this, they've saved money for this. We don't know their story, but it's a great way to get them involved. It's a great way to find out that way to get out there, find these new people, get them involved in the process. They've worked so hard for this. Put community events on your calendar as well. If you know your community has got a large event coming up, maybe a festival, that's a great time to go. It's a wonderful time to get out there. You get to meet so many people and you get to actually take part. Now, when you're doing this, you have to be kind of careful. When you set up your booth and you set up these things, these events, you don't sit behind the booth. That's silly. No one's going to walk up to a table with just two people sitting there. You need to be on your feet, active, walking around, engaging people in conversation, whether you're using a petition as your cover or if you're using a survey as your cover. It's important that you get out there and you actually are taking part in the process. Other things you can look for, new utility subscribers. You can get those lists. Those people are actually setting up house somewhere. And like I said, we've all been there. We've all probably moved at least once or twice in our life. When you're having to do and jump through all the hoops of moving and setting up your utilities, the last thing you are thinking about is becoming registered to vote. And how nice would it be if someone came to your house and made that a seamless process for you? It's actually how I became registered to vote. A lady was going door to door. That's actually how I became registered to vote for the first time. So it's important to get out there. You've got to look for these places. Well, where else can we go? Where else can we go? Military bases are a great place to go. If you have some connection, you're able to do it, that's a great place to go. Churches. I know right now that the Faith and Freedom Coalition is right now doing a massive, massive push with their organizations to get newly registered voters out there. You know, we hear evangelicals, we hear this term, we automatically think those are very engaged voters. And the amount that are tend to be pretty engaged and tend to be fairly conservative people, are pretty conservative people. However, there were some new statistics that came out last week that showed that the evangelical vote is one of the most under-registered demographics out there. That's a shame. That needs to change. That is something that's got to change very quickly. County and state fairs. We already talked about these events. Look for these events in your neighborhood that are going to attract a lot of people. Cultural events. You know, and I know conservatives, sometimes we hear cultural events and we're kind of shut down. We're kind of shut off by that a little bit. Don't be. That's just feeding into another stereotype. That's feeding into another narrative. Get out to these cultural events. Find the people in your community that are there, that are taking part in something. Get out there and find them and get them registered to vote quickly. Gun shows. Second Amendment people, I have never been to a gun show where there was not some variety of voter registration. Gun owners and Second Amendment buffs tend to be huge numbers of voters that are out there and tend to be very conservative. Gun shows are catnip for voter registration drives. We need to be out there. There needs to be a voter registration table set up at every single gun show that you can imagine. If someone is willing to show up at a gun show or going to spend their Saturday looking at guns, chances are they're going to be a pretty conservative person to begin with. And if they're not registered to vote, you can add one on to the conservative candidate, the conservative issues that are out there. It's a great place to go. Country concerts, you know, and I'm not one to feed into stereotypes. I have this accent, and so I'm not really one to kind of feed into a lot of stereotypes. I'm not really even a country music fan myself. However, country music shows tend to be attracting a very conservative audience. Just to show you an example, I was actually at a Toby Keith concert not too terribly long ago, and it was here in Washington, and I went out there, and during the show they flashed this picture of George Bush, former President George W. Bush, and the crowd goes crazy, clapping and cheering, and you know, yay for President Bush, yay for President Bush. Pretty conservative audience at the Toby Keith concert. Fast forward that about 3 weeks, I found myself at a Kanye West show in Atlanta. They also flashed up a picture of President Bush, and the reception of that photograph was not quite as warm of a welcome as it had been at the Toby Keith concert the previous couple of weeks before that. But country shows, they're out there. Get out there and find those people. The trick about going to those large events like that, you need to be really careful. Not everyone that's going to attend those events is going to be eligible to vote where you are. So that's something that would need to be taken into account. You know, those things tend to attract. I live in Virginia. I was at a show in Atlanta. They tend to attract people from all over the place. So also be prepared to encounter that when you go to those events, and don't rely on them solely for your voter registration efforts. Moving along. We already said that newer neighborhoods tend to be great places to go. If people are building houses and going out there and working, those are new people. They're buying new houses. I mean, I guess that's still happening somewhere in America, right? So it's important that you get out there and you find those newly constructed homes. They tend to be new people that are able to buy a house in this economy. They probably, or at least you got a fighting chance at getting their vote for a conservative person. We already said residents can be screened. You know, here, even again, these residents can be screened by asking them to sign a petition. Ask them how they, ask them about a survey question. You know, give them something that's out there that you can actually kind of gauge them on really quickly. The last thing you want to do, and I said it earlier, the last thing you want to do is just walk up blind to someone and say, hey, are you registered to vote? Would you like to register to vote? You have no idea what you've just done. You could have just registered someone for the other guy. You could have registered a dyed-in-the-wool liberal, someone that's not registered to vote where you are. So there definitely needs to be some kind of screening process of what type of voter am I registering? Who am I going after for this instance?
We have a question from one of our viewers at home, and they ask, when you register someone, and let's say you can register in a political party wherever you're from, and they check the political party that you're not a part of, do you have to continue registering them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You cannot retrieve that voter registration form. You cannot take it away from that person. You have, once it is submitted, once they have filled it out, it has to be submitted. Now, what I have seen done there, and you have to submit all of them that you receive. I guess this is a good time to tell you. This also is if you are going to return them yourself, your organization is going to dump them off at the county registrar or whomever themselves, you have to return all of them. In that instance, if I saw someone that was, if I saw someone that was checking a political party that I wasn't a part of, That might be when I just said, okay, well, thanks so much and have a good afternoon, and let them know they can return it themselves to the first office you have, and you got a 50-50 chance they might forget it. But if they turn it back into you, you have to return it yourself, and you can't just snatch it away from them and say, I'm sorry, you're not registering with the right party for me. Can't do that.
Well, as a follow-up to that, and this might be something that our viewers at home might be interested to know, is what happens if you register with someone and they happen to be of a different political party or different core philosophy, and when you go to vote, they have no record of your voter registration?
Absolutely. There are unscrupulous people in this business, and that's one of the sad parts about this business is there definitely are unscrupulous people. First off, it shouldn't take you until you go to register to vote to find out that you're not registered. Once you turn that form in, it takes, depending on the state, it takes about a couple of weeks, and you should get a voter registration card in the mail. If a couple of weeks go by and you have not received that voter registration card, it's strongly advised you don't wait till Election Day. Immediately call your county board of registration, find out if you were registered to vote, go register to vote, and while you're there, also make sure that you report to the registrar you registered with so-and-so of whatever organization at whatever event you were at, and you find it a little strange that your voter registration form didn't quite make it. But you shouldn't wait until Election Day. That should never, ever, ever be the case. You should receive your voter registration card, I would say at the most 2 weeks after you register to vote. I registered here in Virginia. It took, I think it was about a week and a half, and I got my voter registration card in the mail. You should receive some follow-up paperwork that you are indeed registered. If you do not receive that, immediately call your county board of elections, your board of registrars, your circuit clerk, probate judge, whomever it is in your state, your county that handles voter registration, and find out what went wrong, and then make sure you are registered to vote.
Then finally, one more question from one of our viewers at home. This is Brennan from New Hampshire. He asks, do liberals only, or do they actively register voters in liberal districts? Why would they do that? Or is it just a bunch of shenanigans that people talk about?
Absolutely, Brennan. That's an excellent question, Brennan from New Hampshire. Yes, of course they do. They're constantly out there looking, but that's not the only place they are. They're not just in liberal districts, making sure that they're continuing to grow their base. This is exactly what they're doing. If they're already in a liberal district, they're going to register new voters to continue to grow that liberal base. You'll see them out there. We should be doing the exact same thing. Conservatives should be doing the exact same thing. Don't necessarily waste your time going over to, Littleton Fire Station, that tends to be a very liberal voting station, and try to register conservative voters. Your time might be better spent going and building your base up somewhere else, going out there and finding who those new voters are that just can go back to our base. There's a time and a place to outreach to voters in the other districts, and I'm not saying you should ignore them, but you should definitely be out there always trying to continue to grow your base where you can. Always be growing your base out there, Brennan. That's an excellent question. Free advice for you this evening.
Now, do you have any case studies to use as examples for this?
Absolutely, Patty. We're going to get there in just a few moments, but we actually do. We have an excellent case study.
We've got some people asking for it.
Yeah, we'll have one for you up in just a second. There are a couple other things that we can do. Let's go back a little bit more to events. Let's talk a little bit more about events. Before we get to an actual case study, we'll talk a little bit about events. We've already talked a little bit about successful second events, gun shows and county fairs. People are going to be there. High traffic area, a gun show. Who doesn't love the Second Amendment? You've got to get out there, find those voters, and make sure they're getting registered to vote. Country concerts, we've talked about that as well. Making sure that you're out there, and and don't just feed into the stereotype that everyone that attends, a Toby Keith concert, or everyone that attends a, Miranda Lambert or someone like that concert, they're automatically going to be a conservative voter. Never take for granted there needs to be that screening process put into place. There does need to be the screening process. They need to see a tangible result. You need to make sure that your volunteers that are at those events, they can see a line forming, or they can be out there working, taking the forms, and people need to see that what you're doing is working. And if people see a large crowd around your booth, more people are going to be attracted towards you. And sure, you're going to run across some people that either aren't going to side with you on the issue, so you don't want to register that person, or maybe they're already registered. You're going to run across that. But it's all about shaking the pan until you're just panning for gold. You're shaking the pan until you run across those few extra flakes of gold that are out there. A lot of this sounds like a lot of shenanigans, but it actually does work. It's very important that you're constantly working this. Here's another one. Here's one that has to be done very, very carefully. It has to be done smart. A very successful voter registration drive can take place at a senior care facility or at a retirement community. Those are excellent places. I was actually just down in the Villages in Florida myself not too long ago. I was there about a week before Paul Ryan made his appearance there. I like to tell everyone that I was his warm-up act. But that's a great place to go. That's a great place to go. Seniors, they tend to be very conservative people, tend to want to side with the conservatives on the issues. If we're out there working those neighborhoods, you're going to find them. Now, one thing we know about the Village is those people are also very politically active. So you might not run across a lot of people that need to be registered to vote. However, let's not forget, though, they'll know people on their street. The one thing about that community that I learned was that those people know everyone else in the community. They know a lot of things about other people in that community. It kind of goes back to that nosy neighbor on the street. You know, maybe you are that neighbor on your street. If you can't spot that neighbor, it's generally you. It's important that we're out there finding those people. You know, they can point you to the honeypot of where are the unregistered people? Where are the people that have just moved here? Where are the people that we can go after? You kind of need to be careful, though, when you go to these senior and community centers. I can tell you from personal experience, a lot of community centers won't allow a political party in to register unless both political parties can be present. So that's definitely something to consider in your process when you're doing these. However, you come in sometimes just as a nonprofit organization, come in just as a non-political organization. Sometimes they're a little bit more apt to do that for you. Now, I've never done one in a retirement home where I was allowed to go door to door in the retirement home. What I have been allowed to do when I've spoken to management there, we have been allowed at a certain time, we will set up a registration table in the lobby and people will be notified that we're there. And if they would like to come over and register to vote, they're more than welcome to come register to vote, but we're not allowed to go door to door in the retirement community to register them ourselves. So it's very important that you're aware of the rules and you're very respectful. You know, the thing about these senior and retirement communities, I've seen people, I've heard of people, I know of people that have gotten into a little bit of trouble before by going to these communities and registering people that shouldn't be registered or maybe shouldn't be registered for another reason. There actually was an article in the newspaper not too terribly long ago about a family that was outraged when they found out that their, I think she was a great-grandmother of the lady that was in the story. She had been registered to vote, and she had a very, very, very advanced case of Alzheimer's. And that they had purposely, when they had moved her to the home, they had asked that this had not happened. And they were a little bit upset when they found out that she had actually been registered to vote. Obviously, she, you know, unfortunately, through the advanced case of Alzheimer's, she was probably not in the right frame of mind to actually go out and vote. But it's very important that if you're going to do these, they can be very successful and they can be great, but you have to handle them very correctly. They can go wrong very, very, very quickly. A couple other places you should look at. Maybe you have a local religious bookstore in your town. That would be a wonderful place to go. A lot of families have allowed me to, or owners of those have allowed to let me leave voter registration forms in the, right by the cash register. It's a great thing to do. Find those people at gun shops. Go to the gun shops. I mean, gun people, Second Amendment people, they're great, and more often than not, they're with the conservatives on an issue. So go to the gun shops. Hold a voter registration drive at the gun shop one afternoon. That's a really great way to do these. These are really easy, great locations. You know, these are kind of the low-hanging fruit. But you always need to think outside the box a little bit more too. You know, go think about where people are. Where are people that we can go and do this? And, you know, and I hear a lot of people say, well, I like to go to the Walmart, hold a voter registration drive at the Walmart. I'm from a small town in the South. We have two grocery stores. You've got the Piggly Wiggly and you've got the Walmart. Problem there is that people from the neighboring 4 counties come to our Walmart. And so you're not just registering people from where you are. You know, you're not just a targeted voter registration drive. Not saying there's not a time, there's not a place for it, but be prepared for that. Be aware of that you're not always going to be registering. If you go to those big locations like that attract a lot of people, like I said earlier, you're going to get people from all over the place. And so it's very important that you are aware of that. You can also have high school students. Also another great way to go. Those seniors in high school getting ready to graduate. The last thing on their mind, I'll tell you, I was a careless college student not too terribly long ago. Find those people. Get them registered to vote. If we get them while they're young, this goes also to another thing that I hear a lot when I'm working on campaigns is how do we get the youth involved? How do we get the youth vote? What do we do? And the problem is we don't talk to them. We're not registering them to vote. We don't let them think that their vote is important to us because we're not talking to them about it. We're not actively registering them to vote. We're not actively looking for people to get them to register to vote. So it's very important that we constantly are aware. High school students, there are conservative affiliation groups on campus. One that's always a good one, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Future Business Leaders of America. Those tend to be pretty conservative students. So it's very important that you get out there, you find those organizations. College campuses, also another great place to hold a voter registration drive. Kids are from all over the place. They're moving to college. Rarely is a college student going to think, oh, I should actually get involved. I should actually go out and register to vote. I should do something about this. Email with people. Get them involved. Get the college students out there. Go where they are. You know, I remember the first week of college. School's actually starting off right back now, I believe. Right outside the student union, right outside the student bookstore. I'm also from the South. I'm a proud Mississippi State Bulldog. Right there outside the football ticket office. Great place to hold a voter registration drive. You should be out there thinking outside the box, going after where are the students? What are they doing? What are they after? So you need to be out there registering new voters at all times, finding out what makes this a creative, fun, important way to get voter registration up in your area.
Ryan, we actually have a couple questions from Kirsten, who is joining us from Ohio. Thank you, Kirsten, for joining us. Regarding signage at your table, do you suggest promoting the petition you're collecting signatures for in lieu of register to vote here signs?
Thank you, Kristen. That's a very, very, very excellent question. I was actually out in Ohio this weekend. I was in Cincinnati. I am a Gold Star Chili fan myself. It's very important that you realize that, yes, the signage at your table don't have the voter registration sign. Promote the petition or survey that you're going after. Let people know right up front, you know, this is a Second Amendment, protect our guns, whatever your issue is, a pro-life piece, whatever it might be, absolutely. Draw people to your table. No one wants to walk up to a bare table. You know, and you go to some of these events and you just see one of those white folding tables, some pins, maybe there's an American flag on there. Absolutely, your table needs to be attractive in some way to attract people over. But like I said, no voter registration sign. Your idea about having the petition being advertised, your issue being advertised, absolutely, that's a great idea, really great idea to do in lieu of the vote here sign.
Then another question that Kirsten has is she thinks that there's rules against going door to door to personal homes. Are there rules or laws?
You know, that would definitely be that's actually an excellent question. Voter registration fluctuates from state to state. The laws that are in effect vary from state to state. I would love to tell you, Kirsten, that I am an expert in Ohio election law. I'm not personally. I'm not aware of any. I've never heard of anyone say this. I've never heard anyone tell me there's a law against going door to door on a voter registration drive. I've never heard someone say that. But remember, you're not necessarily going door to door on a voter registration drive. You're going door to door to collect signatures for your petition. And oh yeah, if you're not registered to vote, I've got one for you. So check your local laws. I guess is what the most important thing to say would be. Contact your Secretary of State there in Ohio and double check with them just to be on the safe side. Always want to make sure that you dot every I and cross every T.
I have gone door to door in Ohio, and I have gotten chased off of property in Ohio, but I assure you that happens everywhere, so I would definitely talk to your Secretary of State's office like Ryan suggests.
Absolutely, absolutely. You never can be too careful. Definitely needs to be an abundance of caution when you are doing a voter registration drive. It is such a sensitive topic. And in a very important state like Ohio, definitely exercise an abundance of caution. Definitely exercise an abundance of caution when doing this. So moving along, we talked a little bit earlier about the evangelical church captains, the evangelical vote that we always think is out there, and it's predominantly for the conservatives. These people are not registered to vote. It's really kind of the sad fact. And it's kind of shocking when you actually read some of the statistics that are out there that evangelicals are one of the most under-registered demographics in the conservative movement. I myself was shocked by this one as well. I assumed that everyone that I went to church with was just as active as I was, or at least just as engaged to go out and vote as I was. Turns out that's not really the case. So registering at churches, having voter registration drives at churches is definitely something that tends to benefit the conservative candidates, the conservative movement. Kind of like with those nursing homes that we were talking about, there are definite things you have to be aware of when you're going to a church to do a voter registration. Number one, find out who's in charge. Find out who's in charge. Whether that be the priest, the pastor, the minister, maybe there's a chief deacon, whomever it might be. Find out who that person is first, broach the subject with them. Without them, you're not going to get very far. Another helpful hint, I was actually in North Carolina not too long ago, and I had a lady tell me that she had worked very hard on going to every church in her congressional district and making sure that people registered to vote, and she never heard back from anyone. Now, I'm going to kind of tell you this too. I wasn't surprised by that outcome at all. I really was not surprised by that outcome at all. When you're going to a church to do a voter registration drive and people are so tied to their church, and we all know churches tend to become sub-communities. I mean, they tend to become their own individual community. when you walk into a church and it's the first time you've ever been seen by someone, sure, people are going to be friendly to you. They're going to be nice to you, but they don't know you. They don't know you. And if you're coming in with something like this and they're already not registered to vote as it is, they're going to be kind of thrown a little bit by this. And now what I've done in the past is appoint a church captain. Appoint someone in the church that you can use as kind of your go-between. They can kind of be your surrogate. You're kind of, put it another way, they can kind of be your security blanket. You know, I'm here because, you know, Mrs. Jones thinks that I should be here, and Mrs. Jones vouches for me, and everyone knows Mrs. Jones, right? She's first pew, left side of the church, every Sunday morning, every Wednesday, every Sunday evening. Everyone knows her. Find someone in the church that you can use as your entrance piece, someone that you can use as your entree into the church. And then a lot of people come at me with, well, you know, churches are predominantly 501c3 organizations. They can't take part in political processes. Well, you know, and that's true. So political parties rarely are allowed into a church. Rarely are they going to be allowed in. But it's really important that you are still working that angle. One of the stories goes that in 2004, the Bush campaign, President Bush's campaign, had a massive increase in voter registration among evangelicals. The IRS sent letters out to all these churches reminding them that it was against the rules to go out there and register new voters. The important thing you have to remember, all those churches leaders got together and said that the IRS has been allowing activist ministers and activist churches for years to hold voter registration drives, and nothing had ever happened to them. They said, we're going to do this anyway. We dare you to come after our tax status. To this day, to my knowledge, none of those churches that held their voter registration drives lost their tax status. So Patty, earlier you were talking to me a little bit about case studies. What do we want a case study to look like, and how important is voter registration? And to this, the kind of the go-to case here is the 2005 Virginia Attorney General's race. Very hotly contested race. It actually ended up being a precursor actually to the 2009 race for governor. The Republican Party in 2005 registered roughly 7,500 new voters. I think the actual figure is 7,476 new voters. You go all the way down to the Attorney General's race, and the gentleman running for Attorney General won the race by 323 votes. 323 votes. They registered 7,500. They won by 323. The really interesting thing about this race is 2005, the matchup for Attorney General in Virginia was Bob McDonnell and Creed Eads. We all know, if you fast forward, if you follow these issues in Virginia, 2009, that was the rematch for governor. And obviously, Governor McDonnell had not forgotten that loss, and the Virginia GOP, the Virginia Republican Party, had worked very hard at continuing to grow that volunteer, continuing to grow that new voter base. So keys to voter registration. Know who's eligible. Know who is eligible where you are if they are actually eligible to vote. Know who to focus on. Remember, just like anything in campaigns, we want to come at this with a very targeted approach. We want to make sure that we know who we are going after. Know your timeline. Cannot stress that enough. If you are registering voters 2 days before the election, probably not going to happen. Probably not going to be newly registered voters. So you need to be aware of that. Time is definitely of the essence in voter registration drives as the election gets closer. Now that doesn't mean you should forget about registering to new voters, but remember, time is of the essence. They don't count intentions at the ballot box, and so it's very important that we're registering new voters at all times. So know, I told Kirsten earlier, know your state and local laws. Know even if you can actually even register voters. There are a lot of stipulations. Sometimes you yourself have to be a registered voter in that county in some states to actually be able to register people to vote in that state and in that county. So know your election laws. Whenever we would have a voter registration drive, we had pretty much a sheet put together, and it was affectionately called Voter Registration for Dummies. And we just put everything together to make sure that people knew exactly how to register, when to register, and who was eligible. Be on your feet and start conversations. Remember, no one wants to come to an empty table. So the keys to voter registration, don't get bogged down. Don't get bogged down. Continue to work. The more people you talk to, the more likely you're going to be able to go out and find a new voter. Remember, this is panning for gold. We're going to be doing a lot of shaking in order to just find a few flecks of gold at the bottom. Remember to engage as many people as possible. Never actually go into people's homes. I know this sounds like common sense, but just don't do it. Don't go into people's homes. If you're going to do the door-to-door in Ohio, or you're going to do the door-to-door registration anywhere, don't go into people's homes. 2 reasons. 1, it's not safe. 2, that could be somebody just intentionally trying to waste your time. So be extra careful about doing that. Key to this, make sure you turn in the completed forms on time. If people are assuming they are registered to vote and you don't turn their form in, you have technically just disenfranchised them, and that's a federal offense. So make sure you turn these forms in promptly to the correct official. Make sure these things are taken care of. Know your laws, your timeline, and who's eligible. This is just kind of in conclusion, kind of reiterate what we've kind of gone over. Have a clearly defined volunteer plan for this. Make sure your volunteers know exactly who is supposed to be doing this and what they're supposed to be doing. Plan for time. Time is of the essence. Most valuable asset a campaign has. The clock is always ticking to election day. We can find new volunteers. We can raise more money. You can't add a single minute to the election clock. Be creative. I think the main thing here with voter registration drives is be creative. Kind of my tagline for this when I finish up here is I always tell people that there's no really wrong way to do a voter registration drive. There are definitely illegal ways and unethical ways to do a voter registration drive. But as far as ideas for a voter registration drive, there's no such thing as a bad idea. No such thing as a bad idea. If something comes out and it was a complete flop, well, you rework it and you make it work. But there's no bad way to do this. Like I said, there are illegal and there are unethical ways, but there's no bad way. And just remember, I think the key here to remember in this election cycle is that you going and voting by yourself, it's simply not going to be enough this time around. You have to be out there actively involved. And by registering new voters that are going to vote for the conservative candidates, you're amplifying your vote. You can only vote once, but you can amplify it by registering new voters. And just remembering that voting is not going to be enough. And this is something that you can do starting now, moving forward. You need to be out there and trying to register new voters before the election day comes around. And with that, Patty, any further questions?
Yeah, I've got a few questions from home from our viewers. Somebody asked, do voter ID laws have any effect on voter registration drives?
Absolutely. It kind of goes back once again to that knowing who is eligible, knowing what's available, knowing who's eligible. Definitely voter ID laws are definitely going to be playing into some effect here, and the laws vary from state to state again. But absolutely, these will definitely play into it. It all goes back to, once again, knowing who is eligible to actually vote. You need to make sure that you are 100% upfront with voters when you are actually registering them to vote, that they know about the election process, that they will be, if you are in a state that has voter ID laws, they will be provided, they will be necessary for them to provide an ID at election day. Sometimes if you actually are in a state that already requires voter ID laws, I would even recommend, if I were you and I were actually doing a voter registration drive, I would be asking to see an ID before I actually went through the registration process. Once again, just to be on the safe side that you're dotting every I and crossing every T.
Another question we have, regarding the contact information that you can get from a voter registration sheet, should you be recording that for your campaign's sake as well, and where do you put that information?
Once again, I'm going to go back here again and say that it's very important that you do this good information. Some states have caging laws, what we call a caging law, which is where you actually take the information from the voter registration form. Some states have very strict laws on this, some states don't have very strict laws on this. I always decide to err on the side of caution in this instance. When they are filling out my petition or they're doing my survey, that's when I would try to capture as much contact information as possible. That way you don't have to worry about it so much that you copied it from the voter registration file, or someone making an accusation that you copied the information from a voter registration file. I would recommend having a sign-in sheet at the table that complements your survey or complements your petition. That way there can be no accusation of shenanigans or wrongdoing on your part.
Shenanigans certainly is the word of the night for practices with voter registration. We just have one last question.
Sure, Patty.
And the question is kind of a general, what is the greatest challenge that you're going to face when conducting a voter registration drive?
In my opinion and in my experience, it's apathy. It's apathy, which is that's the thing we're fighting constantly in political campaigns, is simply voter apathy. This weekend, I was in Cincinnati, and I actually stayed in northern Kentucky with my mother-in-law in northern Kentucky. Definitely her favorite son-in-law. One of her friends actually even came over to visit, and I would never venture to guess how old Donna is, but Donna probably, if I had to guess, is probably in her early 40s, and told me she had never registered to vote. She had never voted in her life. Voter apathy is the #1 thing you will encounter in this situation. And it's having to be you yourself, you as the activist, making that personal connection with that person and showing them that voting is so important, that their vote does matter, and that it's very important that this election cycle, every vote counts. Every vote is critical. It's very important that you combat a way to fight voter apathy. So when you're doing your voter registration drives, be prepared for people to say, why should I? Why should I care? Why should it matter? Have an answer for that. Voter apathy, #1 killer of conservative candidates.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening, and thank you for your insight on the topic.
Absolutely, Patty. It's always a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us and asking great questions throughout the webinar. As a reminder, tonight's broadcast was recorded and will be available on LI's website. So please join us next time as we discuss absentee and early voting programs, which will be next Wednesday at 12 o'clock p.m. noon Eastern Standard Time. We'll see you then.